Good morning. How are you, my pals? We'll give people a chance to find our show, AT Daily number 2. Yesterday was very exciting. I was privileged to attend the Siyum Hashas, the completion of the 7.5-year cycle of Talmud study in Los Angeles. And there were many fine speakers there. They showed a video that we're going to share later today about the accidental Talmudist. So that was a big honor for me and for Nina and for our community. And among the stories that we heard was one about Rav Ovadia Yosef, a former, huge Torahite in Israel, who has since passed on. But he was once on a journey to the United States, and they stayed by a rabbi's house, and the rabbi mentioned that this Rav was studying all night and in a closet. Now, this is a huge rabbi who goes around in limousines. I mean, literally 1 million people attended his funeral when he died. But when he was in New York to give a speech, and he stayed by this guy, Rabbi Ozeri's house, he studied all night in a closet. Why in a closet? Because his wife was sleeping in the same guest room and he didn't want to disturb her. Why was he studying all night? Because that's his practice. How could somebody study all night? How often could somebody do that? And the image given was just so great, there we go, that I just wanted to share. The image given was, if somebody said to you, go in this closet and count money, and all the money that you count, you can keep, right? So you would probably find no problem staying up all night and counting all the money that you could keep. Well, for Rav Ovadia, studying Torah, it was something he could do all night because everything he learned was like a treasure that went into his treasury. Who's here? Irma Cortez, good morning. Ivan Bauman, Cecilia Lynn, Lena Lutalis says, good evening from Europe. It's great to see you all. I'm sure some people will be watching this later. Today's a work day. Not everybody has the luxury of watching our live show in the morning. But any time is good. And we're going to continue learning from the Talmud. I've signed up. I'm doing this Daf Yomi cycle. So we're in the second day of 7.5 years of study. And this AT Daily show will often, perhaps usually, who knows, maybe always, arise from what I'm learning that day in the Talmud. But I suspect we'll do other subjects as well as we go along. But certainly now, at the beginning of the Daf Yomi cycle, there's just so much to talk about. We are in Tractate Berachos, the first, this is backwards for me, the first tractate of the Talmud. And yesterday we began our journey, and the rabbis who opened the Talmud are talking about from what time may we say the evening Shema, the declaration of God's unity, and until what time may we say the evening Shema. Yesterday we saw there was a disagreement between Rabbi Gamliel and the other rabbis. Rabbi Gamliel saying that you can say the evening Shema until the morning time. So all night is appropriate for the nighttime Shema. And the rabbi said you have to do it by midnight, by the end of the first watch, as they defined it back then. But if you say it later, you have fulfilled your obligation. It's really a fence around the Torah to prevent you from, let's say, saying, I'll say it later, and then you sleep through the night and it's morning and you missed your chance to say the nighttime Shema. So now we're continuing to develop these definitions of how we measure time at night. And this is, remember, in Talmudic time. So about 2,000 years ago, 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, and they didn't have clocks, okay? So how do we define the periods of the night? How do we figure out what midnight is? And so in order to define that, the rabbis had this sense, we're talking about that there are either 3 watches or 4 watches in the night. So a watch in the night is the military definition, right? You're in a platoon, you're out in hostile territory, You're going to have guards around your encampment, and they're going to relieve each other during the night. So apparently the Greek army tended to have 4 watches during the night. The Greeks had 3 watches during the night, and the Romans had 4 watches during the night. So at this period, they were aware of both those histories, sort of in the common culture. And the question is, well, is the Bible talking about 3 watches or 4 watches in the night when we have this sort of common term, watches in the night? And the rabbis determine that we're really talking about 3 watches in the night. So therefore, 3 watches of 4 hours each. And then what's very interesting is that they bring down, and primarily through some of the teaching of Reb Yossi, who we're meeting in this second page of the Talmud. The Talmud starts on page 2, so even though it's daf 3 or page 3, it's the second page of the Talmud. So Reb Yossi had this interesting experience, and we're going to talk more about this in a moment, but basically where he learned that the watches in the night here on earth correspond to the watches in heaven, right? And so in heaven, the night is also divided. Why? Because God looks down on earth, cares about what's happening on earth, cares about what's happening with his children. And in this time, the early Mishnaic time, after the destruction of the Second Temple, there's mourning for the loss, certainly among the Jews, but also by God. God mourns that the temple is gone. God mourns that he sort of was forced to destroy the temple because the Jews misbehaved so badly and lost the right to have a temple on earth. So it's our fault, but just as a parent chastises a child and then the parent would rather not have to punish or chastise the child. It's necessary, but it's still a sad event. And so Rabbi Yosei learned that during the 3 watches of the night, God roars like a lion, lamenting the loss of the temple. How did Rabbi Yosei learn that? So he was once traveling, and he went to Jerusalem, in the ruins of Jerusalem, meaning the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem. And he was traveling on the road, and he didn't want to pray on the road because he would be interrupted by other passersby. So he entered one of these ruins, perhaps the ruin of the temple or some other ruin in Jerusalem that had been sacked by Rome and still bore the marks of that devastation. And he was praying in the ruin, and he got all caught up in thoughts that even became a prophecy about the ruin of the temple and God lamenting the loss of the temple, etc. But then when he came out, Eliyahu, the prophet Eliyahu, who lived in a much earlier time, in biblical times, and had sort of come back. And throughout the Talmud, we'll see that Eliyahu, or Elijah in English, appears to certain of the sages and sort of comes back and talks to them, sometimes in a dream, sometimes in waking, and informs them of certain things. And Eliyahu, in this case, informs Rabbi Yosei that he shouldn't enter a ruin. He shouldn't pray in a ruin. And that if he's worried about being interrupted when he's praying on the road, he should still pray on the road. He should just do an abbreviated prayer. And even an abbreviated prayer is better than entering a ruin. Why is it so bad to enter a ruin? Now, the rabbis discuss this, and they come up basically with 3 reasons why we don't enter a ruin. And this is still halacha today. It's still law today. So number 1, we don't enter a ruin because it's dangerous. Okay, so a ruin could collapse, and we don't put ourselves in danger. And this is generally a valid principle. Because God gave us our lives, we don't endanger our lives unnecessarily. We have a responsibility not to endanger our lives. And a ruin is a dangerous place because, number 1, it could physically collapse. Number 2, a ruin is a dangerous place because demons can be found in ruins. Now, the rabbis here at this early stage of the Talmud are not going to define where demons come from, what creates demons, what demons are, what they're like, do they have names, how they attack us. this is not a section on demonology at all, though that will come much later in the Talmud. Right now, it's just a given that demons exist, that they inhabit ruins, and therefore you don't enter a ruin. However, two can enter a ruin in terms of demons, because demons only attack individuals when they're alone. I think this is very interesting. Now I'm going off Talmud. This is Sal speculating. This is just me speculating. But, I've often wondered, I remember wondering about this a long time ago, 20 years ago, and now it's only gotten so much worse. When somebody would go postal, that's what we used to call it, right? When one of these terrible, terrible events, when somebody who seemed normal for a long time suddenly goes on a rampage and kills his neighbors or his coworkers, or just enters a store and goes crazy, and it doesn't seem to be, might be a terrorist event, might not be, but it's more like a person who seemed to be normal just suddenly seems to go insane and on a murderous rampage. And it's almost like they encounter this pocket of demonic energy. It might come from them. It might just be something that was latent in them for a long time. I think we still don't understand at all the psychology of these people who suddenly become mass murderers. But what's interesting is, if indeed there are somehow these pockets of energy that when people intersect with them, it can really change their psyche in a terrible, terrible way. It's interesting to think that that happens only when people are alone, and not when they go into these ruins in pairs, for example, or two or more people. And maybe, this isolation, I wonder if it's a common denominator among these mass murderers, that they were loners, and that whatever was happening in them and was developing in them and becoming murderous in them, might not have happened if they weren't so isolated and they could see that this is just craziness that's coming into them. That's speculation for another time. Going back to the rabbis of the Talmud. So there's two reasons given so far why you don't enter a ruin. One is that it's physically dangerous. Another, that you could encounter a demon there, but that really applies only if a person enters alone. And the third is suspicion. And by suspicion, the rabbis meant that the ruin might be a location where one might encounter a prostitute. And so again, if two upstanding people enter the ruin, then we're not so worried about suspicion. But if one goes in, maybe he's going in for a nefarious reason, maybe to cohabit with a prostitute. Along the journey that we're going to have through the Talmud, we're going to be talking about all different facets of life. Sexuality is going to be one of them. So, this. If you consider this too adult a topic, then be warned. But for today, we're not going to be talking too much about prostitution. It's just that is one of the reasons why one would not enter a ruin alone. It's the third reason that is given. Reb Yosei, who had this experience and learned while he was praying in a ruin that he shouldn't have gone in there, and learned about God, he's a really leading personality in the Talmud. We'll see him again and again. And Reb Yosei's opinions, he was a Tana, so he's from the Mishnaic period, living before the year 200 of the Common Era. And his opinions were very sound, always well-reasoned. He was also a very humble man, very pious man, and he made a living as a tanner, which is very interesting because tanning is something we'll see later. It's somebody who deals with hides. Back then was considered a very lowly occupation, perhaps because it stains your hands, you carry a smell with you after you've been doing that work. But this very, very great and esteemed rabbi, did that occupation and had no problem with it. And certainly the rabbis teach, and we heard yesterday at the Siyum how important it is to be able to make a living as well as study Torah. It's something that you can do both things in your life. Somebody who has very little time available because he works so hard to provide for his family, but with that little bit of time that he has, makes time to have some regular Torah study in his day, that person is to be very highly regarded. But somebody who works very hard, And then when he finally has a moment to rest, just rests and never thinks about when he's going to bring Torah study into his life. Well, that person, even though he might work very hard, is considered Talmudically an idler, right? So the fact that you're listening to this program, you're making time in your day to learn some Torah with us. Hopefully you'll go and read on your own. Perhaps you're even doing the Daf Yomi cycle along with us. It's amazing. It's something to really be honored that you're making regular time for Torah study in your day. And you should know that according to the rabbis, all people, when we get to heaven, will be asked. The first question, were you honest in your business dealings? The second question, did you make regular times for Torah study, for Bible study? So it's a very important thing to work into your day. Right away here at the beginning of the Talmud, we see how easily we digress. We've been talking about the times of the night that we can say or not say the Shema, and then we got into discussing ruins and the reason we don't enter ruins. We might digress because we encounter a rabbi and this rabbi also taught another teaching, or we encounter a subject and on this subject it was also taught. So there's a lot of different reasons we might digress, and you can expect that digressions will always happen. So here on Daf Gimel, the third page, Daf 3, right, the second page of the Talmud, we had another digression that came about. And why did we go there? I think it was another halacha. Yes, that Rabbi Zerika said, that Rabbi Ami said, that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said. So this idea of giving the provenance of teaching is very important. If you hear something from a major teacher, when you repeat it later to your friends, you should say, I heard this from. And the rabbis model that very closely. It's a big honor, an important teaching, that when you hear something, you then relate it later and you say where you heard it and who said it. And so having related about what this chain of rabbis said about the watches in the night, we also learn from them a halacha relating to what we can and cannot say in the presence of the dead. And here we're talking about literally if someone has died and the corpse is in the house, the deceased is there. Also, by extension, this applies a little bit in cemeteries. But right now we're talking about literally there's a body in the house. And so one thing that we don't want to do actually is discuss Torah in the presence of the dead. Why? Because they can no longer discuss Torah with us. And it's almost like mocking the dead, making them feel bad about the fact that they're dead and can no longer participate in Torah conversation. And we're very sensitive to matters of the dead, relating to the dead. So there's a bit of a disagreement. What are you not allowed to say in the presence of the dead? And it's finally resolved like this, that Torah, you don't speak at all in the same room with a dead person, with a deceased. Matters not relating to Torah, you have to be at least 4 cubits away from the body if you want to talk about things other than Torah. But really, the only thing you're supposed to talk about, and within 4 cubits, what you can talk about, and according to all opinions, the only thing you can talk about in front of a dead person is matters relating to the dead person, right? So where's he going to be buried? What time is the funeral going to be? When is the Shiva? Who's going to attend? Things like that we can talk about in front of the deceased because it honors the deceased, that we're attending to his needs. And in fact, attending to the needs of the dead is called the Hesed Shel Emes, the true kindness. Why? Because the dead person cannot return the favor, cannot return the kindness. So anything you do to help a dead person, have a proper funeral, is called the true kindness. And as I mentioned, it relates a little bit to cemeteries. For example, I have my tzitzis here, so that's a big mitzvah that a Jewish man wears tzitzis all the time. But if we enter a cemetery, because we are delicate and we are concerned with the honor of the dead, we put the tzitzis in our pocket and don't flaunt the fact that we can still do that mitzvah and the dead people cannot. And then we finish this daf Gimel, with a discussion about David, King David. We've been talking about watches in the night, and so sort of in parentheses, we bring in King David, who's very interesting. He's sort of like the greatest Torah scholar of all time. I mean, he wrote the book of Psalms, right? And David studied Torah all the time. During the day, he would, be a king and rule the kingdom and do what was needed to be done to rule the kingdom. But at night, he would study Torah, and he would get very little sleep. And basically, he would just sleep at the beginning of the night and get up at midnight and then start studying Torah. How would he know to get up at midnight? How did he know that it was midnight? He didn't have an alarm clock, right? He didn't have an astronomer gauging the exact time of the stars and then come in and wake him up. Well, David was blessed to have a harp, a lyre, L-Y-R-E, that special divine wind would blow at midnight, and it would play the harp, and it would wake him up, and that's how he would know that for him it was time to get up and study Torah. And tomorrow, God willing, we'll continue with Daf Daled, the fourth official. I'm not going to keep saying this, okay? Always, the third day of Daf Yomi is going to be Daf number 4 because the book starts on page 2. All right. So on Daf Daled tomorrow, we'll continue with some issues relating to King David and more about Shema and the times of the Shema. And that's our AT Daily for today. Let me just see if there's any questions. What am I seeing here? Mickey Truster in New York, sick at home today, so I have some time for listening. Oh, it's so great to see you, Mickey, and may you have a refuah shlema. We'd like to see you fully healed as soon as possible. Chuck Wright asking, can we still use the Zoom software? Let me think about that, Chuck. For now, I'm doing this AT Daily like this, just using the phone in the portrait mode, and I can see people's comments. So that's how we were going to do it for the time being. Christo Cheney says, thank you for your time. For now, I'm having to use the old Sonsino Talmud. Okay, that is a translation from the early 20th century. But you can augment that with on your phone with Sefaria.org, where I think it's the Koran translation. I'm really enjoying the Koran this time around. The art scroll is just fantastic and really good for some of the later commentaries. And if you ever had to look something up, I think the art scroll would be wonderful because there's so many notes in it about every line in the Talmud. But the Koran, I think, is so great because it tells you when there's a disputed matter, what the halacha is, sort of background about who the sages are, what they were like, what their relationships were, a lot of illustrations and charts. So and room to take notes. So for now, I'm enjoying using the Koran. Maybe we'll publish it later. The Agudas Yisrael has, at the Siyum, gave out a list of online resources. We've mentioned some. They're going to be in the description here in yesterday's show. And also Real Clear Daf is another one that you can look up. Very, very useful. Okay. Great. Yeah, using Safari also on my iPod. Great. Safari's awesome because it just links to so many things. And I think that's very useful to people. All right. So guys, thanks so much for tuning in. I want to keep it short for people who are looking at it later in the day. They shouldn't see that the duration of our show is too long and imposing for them to check it out and watch. I want to keep it short. I'm not doing a daf shir, right? I'm not teaching you the whole page. I'm sort of giving you highlights, what stood out to me, what I think bears looking closely at, and somewhat of a summary of everything that took place, but not everything, right? So if you want a proper daf shir, find one in your town. Make sure you read the whole page if that's what you're going for. And if you're not doing Daf Yomi, okay, well then this is going to be definitely a great teaching tool for you as I get better and better at relating what I'm reading in each page. All right, thank you, my good friends. Sending you all lots of love from Los Angeles. Take care.